There are doors in this world that were never meant to be opened again, not because of what they conceal, but because of what it costs to close them in the first place. Some doors guard secrets, others protect disgrace, and a rare few hold both, sealed like an old photograph, too painful to study for long, yet too meaningful to destroy. This is the story of one such door. It remained locked for 60 years on a plantation in Louisiana, its key lost, its purpose erased from memory, forgotten by everyone except one. When it was finally forced open on a sweltering September morning in 1927, no one found gold, skeletons, or scandalous letters. What they discovered was something far more unsettling, proof of a life abruptly interrupted, a room preserved in stillness, like a pocket watch frozen at the precise second its owner's heart gave out. But to understand the weight of that room, you have to return to a time when the door was still open, when the space inside was alive with breath and motion. Back to when the plantation house on Bayou Sorrel Road was home to the Beaumont family and the 43 souls bound to their land. Back to April of 1865, when the old world was collapsing even as a new one struggled to be born. The Beaumont plantation stood along the banks of Bayou Sorrel like a wounded cathedral 3 miles south of Plaquemine, Louisiana. From the river, the house rose through the cypress trees, white columns leaning slightly east, wide galleries missing boards like broken teeth, tall windows reflecting the water below like weary eyes. The paint flaked away in sheets. The gardens had surrendered to neglect. Trumpet vines climbed the pillars as if trying to pull the entire structure back into the soil from which it rose. War had stamped Louisiana the way a boot sinks into wet earth, and the Beaumonts bore that imprint deeply. Charles Beaumont returned home in March of 1865, just 2 weeks before Lee's surrender at Appomattox. He had left as a major, leading men he'd grown up beside into battles whose names he would later refuse to utter. He came back as simply Charles. No rank, no pride, no remaining illusions. He was 41, but the war had aged him beyond his years. His hair had turned almost entirely grey in 4 seasons, and he carried himself with a stiff, unnatural rigidity, as though standing upright required constant effort. He was thinner now. His uniform sagged on his frame, and when he finally removed it on his first night home, his wife Margaret noticed the tremble in his hands as he worked the buttons loose. They had been married for 19 years, long enough for her to read him the way a sailor reads the sky. And what she saw in his eyes that night told her the truth. The man who had marched away in 1861 had not truly returned. Someone else had come home wearing his face. Margaret was 38, though hardship had carved years into her features that no calendar could explain. Running a plantation through wartime had forced her into choices she had never been taught how to make, deciding whom to trust, which debts to delay, how to stretch supplies meant for weeks into months. She had sold off the family silver one piece at a time, watched the fields weaken year after year as tools broke and replacements never came. She smiled and lied to neighbors about their condition, even as the house itself seemed to rot around her. They had one child, Robert, 17 now. He had been 13 when his father left for war, too young to enlist despite his desperate pleas to falsify his age. That refusal had lodged itself inside him like a splinter. Now he carried the belief that he had failed some unspoken trial of manhood, a test he'd never been permitted to take. He was tall like Charles, but still awkward in his height, his body not yet settled into the shape it would one day claim. And none of them, not Charles, not Margaret, not Robert, could yet know that somewhere within that decaying house a door stood waiting, quiet, locked, and already preparing to become a witness to something history would try very hard to forget, all angles and awkward energy, with eyes that alternated between defiance and desperate need for approval. The war had changed him too, just in different ways. He'd watched his mother become hard. He'd learned that the world he'd been raised to inherit was built on sand, and he'd developed a cold pragmatism that sometimes frightened Margaret when she caught glimpses of it. The 43 people who remained on the land after emancipation stayed for various reasons, none of them simple. Some, like Sarah Hewitt, had nowhere else to go. She was 62, had been born in the quarters, and her arthritis made travel impossible. The proclamation had given her freedom, but freedom without resources is just a different kind of cage. She stayed because at least she knew this one. Others had family in the cemetery beyond the east fields, 3 generations buried under the live oaks, their graves marked with wooden crosses and stones. Ja Mepui had a wife and 2 children in that ground, taken by fever in 1859. He couldn't leave them. Wouldn't. A few stayed because they'd been promised wages that sometimes materialized and sometimes didn't, but at least there was a roof that mostly didn't leak and meals that were meager but regular. Moses Durant was one of these. Moses was 28, compact and watchful, with a kind of quiet intelligence that made people underestimate him right up until the moment they realized their mistake. His hands were scarred from years of working tobacco and indigo, thick calluses, old burns from the processing vats, a missing piece of his left thumb from a cutting accident when he was 14. He'd been born on the property, as had his father Philip before him. He'd learned to read in secret, taught by a minister who'd come through once and left behind a Bible with notes in the margins. After the proclamation, Charles Beaumont had offered Moses a position as foreman, a title that meant Moses was caught between 2 worlds, trusted by neither the workers he oversaw nor the family he reported to. He was supposed to organize labor, settle disputes, and serve as a buffer between the Beaumonts and everyone else. It paid slightly more than the other workers received when payment came at all. Moses had taken the job because he understood leverage. As foreman, he had access to the main house, to conversations, to information. And information, he'd learned, was the only currency that couldn't be devalued by war. But there was one person on the plantation who existed in a category entirely separate from everyone else, floating above the normal hierarchies like smoke above a fire. Amélie Laurent Oak. Occupied a room on the 3rd floor of the main house, accessible only by a narrow servant staircase that wound up from the back of the house like a spiral shell. The staircase was steep with worn treads that creaked in specific patterns. 3 steps up, silence, 2 more steps, a groan like a person sighing. People who used those stairs regularly learned to count the sounds without thinking, the way you learn the rhythm of your own breathing. The 3rd floor itself had been built as servant quarters originally, back when the house was new and the Beaumonts had a staff of 14 living upstairs. After the economy collapsed in the 1850s, most of those positions were eliminated. The rooms were converted, some to storage, some to nurseries for children who never materialized. One to a sewing room that Margaret had used before the war when she'd still had time for such things. Amal's room was at the end of the hall under the peaked roof. It was small, maybe 12 feet x 14, with slanted ceilings and a single dormer window that faced east. From that window you could see over the live oak trees all the way to the bayou, and on clear mornings the water looked like hammered silver. No one could quite agree on when Amelia had arrived at the plantation. Charles claimed she'd been there since before the war, a distant cousin from New Orleans whose family had fallen on hard times during the Panic of 1857. He said she'd needed a place to stay, and family was family, so they'd taken her in. His story was consistent but vague on details. He could never remember which side of the family she was related to or what her maiden name had been or exactly when she'd arrived. Before the war was as specific a S he'd get. Margaret told a different story to the neighbors who still visited. She said Amelie was a war widow, a friend of the family whose husband had died at Shiloh. Out of Christian charity, they'd offered her refuge. In Margaret's version, Amelie was meant to be temporary, just until she recovered from her grief and could make arrangements to live elsewhere. But the war had dragged on. Arrangements had become impossible, and somehow temporary had become permanent. Robert didn't talk about Amelie at all. When asked directly, he'd change the subject or claim he didn't remember much about her. But sometimes late at night, the house servants reported seeing him standing at the bottom of the 3rd floor stairs, just staring upward at the darkness above, as if trying to solve a puzzle he didn't have all the pieces to. Amelie herself seemed to exist outside of time and explanation. She was perhaps 35, perhaps 40. It was impossible to tell. She had that quality some women possess of being ageless, with dark hair she wore in a simple bun and pale skin that suggested she didn't spend much time in the Louisiana sun. Her eyes were grey, the color of river fog, and they had a way of looking at you that made you feel like she was reading something written on your soul in a language only she could understand. She rarely came downstairs. In the early days, whenever those had been, she'd occasionally join the family for dinner, sitting quiet and still as a portrait while conversation flowed around her. But as the war progressed, those appearances became rarer. By 1864, she'd stopped coming down entirely. Deline Carter, one of the house servants who'd chosen to stay on after emancipation, had taken on the task of bringing food to the third floor. Deline was 43, thin as a rail fence with eyes that missed nothing and a mouth that knew when to stay shut. She'd been working in the Beaumont house since she was 12, and she understood its rhythms the way a sailor understands tides. She knew which floorboards creaked, which windows stuck, which doors swelled in humidity, and which ones shrank. She knew where Margaret hid her laudanum and where Charles kept his whiskey. She knew Robert had a collection of drawings under his mattress that would horrify his mother. And she knew Amelie better than anyone else in the house, though better was relative. "That woman's got ghosts," Deline told Moses one evening in May, about a month after Charles had returned from the war. They were in the kitchen house, Deline preparing a dinner tray, while Moses waited to discuss the week's work schedule with Charles. "I've been bringing her meals for near about 2 years now, and I ain't never seen her smile. Not once, not even a little." "Maybe she doesn't have much to smile about," Moses said, watching Delphine arrange bread and cold chicken on a plate. "None of us do, but we still manage sometimes." Deline added a cup of tea to the tray, checking the temperature with her finger. "But Miss Emily, she's different. Sometimes when I knock on her door, I hear her talking to herself, in French mostly, but sometimes English, having whole conversations, asking questions and answering them like there's somebody else in there with her." "Maybe there is." Deline cut her eyes at him. "Don't even joke about that. This house got enough troubles without adding hints to the list. What does she talk about? Can't always tell. My French ain't good enough to follow most of it, but I heard her say names sometimes. Men's names, mostly. And one time, Deline lowered her voice even though they were alone. One time I heard her crying, just sobbing like her heart was broke clean in half. And she kept saying, 'I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry,' over and over. Must have said it 100 times. Moses filed this information away in the careful mental catalogue he kept of everything he observed. "She ever mentioned why she's sorry? If she did, she didn't tell me. But Moses, I'll tell you something strange. That woman's room is always locked. Always from the inside. I knock. I wait. She unlocks it and opens it just wide enough to take the tray, then closes it and locks it again. Takes maybe 5 seconds total, and in those 5 seconds, I've tried to see into that room, but she keeps it dark. Curtains always drawn, even in daytime. What do you think she's doing in there?" Delphi shook her head slowly. "Nothing good or everything good, depending on how you look at it. But whatever it is, she doesn't want anybody to see." Moses helped her carry the tray to the bottom of the servants' stairs. Deline climbed with the practiced balance of someone who'd done this hundreds of times, not spilling a drop of tea despite the steep angle. Moses watched her disappear into the shadows above, then heard the pattern of her footsteps. 10 steps, pause, 5 more steps, stop. Then a soft knock. "Miss Emily, got your dinner?" A long silence. Then the distinct sound of a lock turning, iron on iron, the creak of hinges, a murmur of voices too quiet to make out words. Another creak and the lock again. Deline descended with an empty tray. "Shh. "E say anything?" Moses asked. "Just thank you, same as always." "But Moses, I saw something today I ain't seen before." "What?" Her hands. When she reached for the tray, her hands were covered in ink. Black ink all over her fingers, smudged on her wrists like she'd been writing for hours straight without stopping to wash. "Writing what?" "That," Deline said grimly, "is the question, ain't it?" The trouble started 3 weeks later on a Thursday afternoon in June when the heat lay over the plantation like a wool blanket soaked in water. Charles had been in his study going over the accounts, trying to reconcile the plantation's expenses with the meager income from their last indigo crop. The numbers didn't match. They hadn't matched for years, but he kept hoping that if he looked at them long enough, they'd somehow rearrange themselves into something that made sense. He'd been working with a leather-bound ledger, one of 3 he used to track different aspects of the plantation's finances. This particular ledger contained wage records, who was being paid what, when payment was made, how much was still owed. It was a depressing document, full of debts that exceeded assets, promises that exceeded resources. Charles had set the ledger on the corner of his desk. while he poured himself a drink, whiskey, warm in a crystal glass that had somehow survived the war when so many other things hadn't. He'd stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the fields where workers were bent over the young indigo plants, their shapes wavering in the heat shimmer. When he turned back to his desk, the ledger was gone. He stared at the empty spot where it had been, his mind not quite accepting what his eyes were telling him. He checked the floor, thinking maybe it had fallen. Nothing. He checked the other papers on his desk, thinking maybe he'd absent-mindedly set it down somewhere else. It wasn't there. He searched his study methodically, the shelves, the other desk behind the furniture. He checked the library next door, then the parlor. The ledger had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. "Margaret," he called, his voice sharp with the edge of panic that comes when the world stops following its own rules. Margaret appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She'd been in the kitchen, making preserves, and her face was flushed from the heat of the stove. "What's wrong?" "My ledger. The wage ledger. It's gone. Gone. Charles, you must have misplaced it." "I didn't misplace it. It was here on this desk 30 seconds ago. I turned around, and when I turned back it was gone." Margaret's expression shifted from concern to the careful patience she used when she thought he was being irrational. "Perhaps you left it upstairs or in the library earlier." "I haven't been upstairs today, and I've already checked the library." He was moving through the room again, looking in the same places he'd already searched. Someone took it. Who would take a ledger? "The servants have been in the kitchen all afternoon. Robert's out riding. I've been right here and I didn't see anyone come or go," but even as she said it, they both thought of the same person. "Emily," Charles said. Margaret's expression tightened. "Emily hasn't been downstairs in months. Why would she suddenly decide to steal a ledger?" "I don't know, but she's the only person in this house who moves around like a ghost, appearing and disappearing. Who else could have taken it?" "Charles, you're being paranoid." "Am I?" "Think about it, Margaret. We don't really know anything about that woman. We don't know where she came from. We don't know why she's really here. We don't know what she does up in that room all day. She could be doing anything." "She could be." He stopped the thought, too paranoid to speak aloud, even in his current state. But Margaret understood. "You think she's spying on us?" "Charles, the war is over. Who would she even be spying for?" "I don't know. Maybe not spying. Maybe just gathering information for purposes we don't understand." They stood in silence for a moment, the grandfather clock in the corner ticking loudly in the quiet room. Finally, Margaret said, "I'll ask Deline to inquire next time she brings up a meal, gently. We don't want to accuse her of anything." But that evening, when Charles went up to the third floor himself, he found Emily's door locked as always. He knocked politely at first, then more insistently. "Amelie, I need to speak with you. A ledger has gone missing from my study, and I need to know if you've seen it." "No answer, Emily. Please, this is important. The ledger contains sensitive information about the plantation's finances. If you took it by accident, there's no harm done. Just return it and we'll say no more about it." Still no answer. He knocked harder, his knuckles starting to hurt against the solid oak. "Ame, I know you're in there. I can see light under the door. Open up right now." Finally a voice, quiet, tired, but firm. "I haven't taken anything from you, Charles. I haven't been downstairs in months. Whatever you've lost, you'll have to find it yourself. T. Hen, let me in. Let me see that you don't have it. No." The flatness of that single word stopped him cold. There was no negotiation in it, no possibility of compromise, just a simple, absolute refusal. "This is my house, Emily. I have a right." "You have many rights, Charles, but entering my room without permission isn't one of them. Not anymore. The world has changed. Or haven't you noticed?" He stood outside that door for 10 more minutes, alternating between demands and pleading, but the only response was silence. Eventually, he went back downstairs, his face dark with anger and something else, something that looked almost like fear. The ledger reappeared 3 days later, tucked between 2 books in the library. Charles swore he'd checked that exact spot multiple times. Margaret suggested he'd simply overlooked it in his agitation. "Clear's throat." Robert said nothing but watched, his father with an expression that might have been pity, and upstairs in the locked room on the 3rd floor, lamplight burned long into the night. Moses first noticed something was wrong with the old overseer's cottage in early July. He'd been walking the property boundaries, checking fence lines and drainage ditches when he'd passed the small building that sat about 100 yards from the main house, half hidden by a stand of magnolia trees. The cottage had been empty since Jack Winslow, the previous overseer, had left right after the war ended. Winslow had been a hard man with a taste for violence that even Charles had found excessive at times, though not excessive enough to fire him. When emancipation came, Winslow had packed his belongings and disappeared overnight, as if he'd been waiting for an XQ. See to leave. Good riddance, most people thought. The cottage had sat empty since then, slowly deteriorating, but as Moses walked past it that July morning, he noticed the door was slightly ajar. He was certain it had been shut and locked the last time he'd checked 2 weeks before. He approached carefully, scanning for signs of occupancy. The door hung crooked on its hinges, one of which had come loose from the frame. Inside, the cottage was dim and smelled of mildew and old tobacco. The furniture was still there, a narrow bed, a table, 2 chairs, a wardrobe with its door hanging open. Dust lay thick on every surface, but someone had been inside recently. Moses could see footprints in the dust, small and neat, definitely not his own. They led from the door to the center of the room, then stopped at a spot near the hearth. Moses knelt down, examining the floor. The boards here were older than the rest of the cottage, probably salvaged from another building when this one was constructed. One of them looked loose. He worked his fingers into the gap and pried it up. Underneath was a space about 8 in deep running between the joists, and in that space was an oilcloth bundle. Moses lifted it out carefully. It was heavier than he expected, and when he unwrapped it, his hands started to shake. Papers, dozens of them, maybe 100, letters, journal pages, what looked like copied documents, all carefully organized and tied with string into categories. He didn't read them there. Some instinct told him this wasn't something to be examined in an abandoned cottage in broad daylight. Instead, he rewrapped the bundle, replaced the floorboard, and carried the oilcloth back to his own queue. Yorters, a small cabin he shared with James Pruitt and Samuel Price, 2 other workers who'd stayed on after emancipation. Old, deteriorating, expensive to maintain. In 1927, they made the decision to demolish the main house and sell the land in parcels. They hired a salvage company to strip anything valuable from the house before demolition. Copper pipes, wood paneling, brass fixtures, anything that could be resold. The salvage crew was given 2 weeks to work before the demolition team arrived. Tommy Reeves was 19 years old, broad-shouldered and perpetually cheerful, the kind of young man who found adventure in everything, even in tearing down old houses. He'd been working for Southern Salvage Company for 8 months, and he loved the work. Never knowing what you'd find in these old places, the physical challenge of dismantling structures, the camaraderie of the crew, the Beaumont house was their biggest job yet. 3 stories, 14 rooms, enough salvageable material to keep them busy for weeks if the timeline allowed it. On September 14th, Tommy was assigned to check the 3rd floor for copper piping. The company owner, Mr. Guidry, had said there should be plumbing up there, remnants of an old bathroom installation that had never been completed. Tommy climbed the narrow servant staircase. 3 steps, silence, 2 steps, groan, counting without thinking, the way people do with familiar rhythms. The 3rd floor was dim and close with slanted ceilings and the smell of dust and old wood. There were 3 rooms visible, 2 small ones that had been bedrooms, now empty except for broken furniture, and 1 larger space that might have been a sitting room. Tommy checked all 3 for pipes. Found some, marked them for removal, made notes on his clipboard, but something was bothering him about the hallway. It felt wrong somehow. He walked its length, measuring with his tape measure. The hallway, according to his measurements, should have been about 22 feet long, but his tape only showed 14 feet from the stairwell to the wall. 8 feet were missing. Tommy knocked on the end wall experimentally. Hollow. Definitely hollow. "Hey, Mr. Guidry," he called down the stairs. "I think there's a room behind this wall up here." It took the crew 2 hours to break through. First they removed the painting. The landscape of the bayou, its colors faded after 60 years. Then they attacked the false wall with crowbars and hammers, pulling away boards that had been professionally installed but were now brittle with age. Behind the false wall, they found more boards, thick ones nailed directly into the doorframe, multiple layers deep. Somebody really didn't want this opened, Guidry muttered, prying away another board. Finally, they reached the door itself, heavy oak, solid with a lock that had rusted in place. It took another hour to force the lock when it finally gave way with a crack that sounded like a bone breaking. The door swung inward on hinges that screamed with decades of disuse. Air rushed out, stale, dry, smelling of paper and time and something else they couldn't quite identify. Death, maybe, though there was no body. Tommy was the first one through the door, holding an electric torch. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a room exactly as it had been left 60 years before. A narrow bed made, but never slept in again. A dresser with a brush still on top of it. Hair, still caught in the bristles. A wardrobe with dresses hanging inside. Styles from the 1860s faded and moth-eaten. And papers, God, so many papers. They covered every surface. The desk, the floor, the bed, boxes stacked in corners, all of them carefully organized, labeled, dated, decades of documentation preserved in the dry-sealed room like artifacts in a tomb. "What the hell is all this?" Gry breathed, picking up a page from the nearest pile. Tommy had found something on the desk, a letter addressed to whoever opens this door. He picked it up carefully, the paper brittle with age, but still readable. His lips moved as he read, his expression changing from curiosity to shock to something like awe. "Boss," he said quietly, "you need to read this. All of it. This isn't just some old papers. This is history, real history, the kind nobody talks about." They spent the rest of that day in the room reading by torchlight, trying to understand the scope of what they'd found. Journal entries detailing plantation operations, letters documenting intelligence passed to Union forces during the war, financial records showing illegal transactions, testimonies from enslaved workers, their voices preserved in careful handwriting, and at the center of it all, Amal's own account. Hundreds of pages documenting her years of gathering evidence, her reasons for doing it, her guilt and complicity and desperate hope that the truth would matter. "We need to stop the demolition," Tommy said as the sun set outside the sealed window. "We need to preserve this, all of it." Guidry nodded slowly. "I'll call the timber company. Tell them what we found. This isn't our decision to make." The next morning, Arton Boudreau read about the discovery in the Plantation Sentinel. The headline read, "Secret Room Discovered in Beaumont Plantation House. Historical Documents Found." Boudreau, now in his 52nds and still serving as parish clerk, felt a shock of recognition. The Beaumont Plantation, a sealed room, documents. He went to the parish archives and found Moses Durant's letter exactly where it had been filed 26 years earlier. The envelope was yellowed, the wax seal intact. Across the front in Moses's careful handwriting, to be opened only when the third-floor room is unsealed. Boudreau broke the seal and read the letter, read it twice, then a third time, understanding dawning with each reading. He took the letter to the salvage company's temporary office at the plantation. Guidry and his crew had stopped work, waiting for instructions from the timber company about how to proceed. The room had been closed again, this time locked to prevent lutters or the merely curious from disturbing the documents. "I have something you need to see," Boudreau said, handing over Moses's letter. Gry read it aloud so the whole crew could hear. When he finished, there was silence. "So this woman," Tommy said finally, "she locked herself in there with all those documents and died in there." "Maybe," Guidry said. "The letter doesn't say for certain, but whether she did or not, she meant for this room to stay sealed for exactly this long. 60 years, long enough for the people named in the documents to be gone, long enough for the truth to be history instead of accusation." "What do we do with it?" someone asked. Boudreau cleared his throat. "I've already contacted Louisiana State University. Their history department is very interested. EY want to catalog and preserve everything, make it available for research and the demolition." The timber company agreed to delay it. They're in negotiations now with the State Historical Society about possibly preserving the house, or at least this room. But regardless, the documents will be saved. Over the next 3 months, a team of historians from LSU carefully removed every document from the sealed room. They catalogued, photographed, and preserved each page, thousands of them representing 7 years of meticulous documentation. The Amélie Laurent collection, as it came to be known, was unlike anything in the university's archives. Most historical documents from the Plantation era came from the perspective of owners and overseers, the people who had power and used it to shape the narrative. But Amal's archive included voices that had been systematically silenced, enslaved workers testifying to their own experiences, documenting their own stories. The historians found Moses Durant's duplicate documents too. Boudreaux had remembered them from the letter and suggested they might be buried in the Plantation cemetery. They dug where Moses had indicated and found the waterproof box exactly where he'd left it, its contents still intact after decades underground. The collection was made public in 1928. It caused a sensation. Newspapers across the South ran stories about the secret archive of the Beaumont Plantation. Some papers praised the discovery as important historical documentation. Others condemned it as biased, claiming Amélie had exaggerated or fabricated details. A few plantation families whose ancestors were mentioned in the documents threatened legal action, though nothing came of it. But among historians and researchers, the collection was recognized as extraordinary. Here was evidence of plantation operations documented not from the perspective of justification, but of witness. Here were names and stories that would have been lost otherwise. Here was truth preserved at great cost. One historian, Dr. Elenina Hughes of LSU, wrote in her analysis, "The Amélie Laurent collection represents a unique convergence of conscience and courage. Miss Laurent was complicit in the system she documented. She lived in comfort provided by others' suffering. She benefited from structures of oppression even as she recorded them. She never claimed to be a hero or a savior, but she did something crucial. She refused to let the truth be erased. Her archive isn't perfect. It's filtered through her perspective, limited by her access and understanding, shaped by her own guilt and moral struggle. But it's honest in ways that official records of the era almost never are. It names names, it tells stories, it preserves voices that would otherwise be silent. And perhaps most importantly, it demonstrates that even those who benefit from injustice can choose to bear witness against it. Miss Laurent couldn't undo what had been done. She couldn't free the enslaved or give back what had been taken. But she could document the truth and protect it for a future that might be ready to hear it. That she sealed herself away to do this work, that she gave her freedom and possibly her life to preserve this evidence, speaks to the weight she felt. She understood that some truths are worth protecting even at great personal cost, especially those truths that powerful people would prefer to, forget. The collection remained at LSU, available to researchers. Over the decades, it was used in countless dissertations, books, and documentaries about plantation life, the Civil War era, and Reconstruction. The 43 names on Amal's list became the subject of genealogical research. Descendants were found. Family histories were reconstructed. Stories were reclaimed. Moses Durant's letter was framed and displayed alongside the collection. His words a testament to the alliance that had protected the truth. It mattered enough for Miss Amélie to lock herself away. It mattered enough for me to spend decades protecting it. It should matter enough for whoever comes next to at least consider what it means. But one question was never answered. Did Amélie die in that room? When the salvage crew first opened it, they found no body, no bones, no evidence of human remains. The bed was made as if waiting for someone who never came to sleep. The room showed signs of long habitation, but no signs of death. Charles Beaumont's records, found in a separate archive, showed that he'd paid for a burial in 1867 and placed a marker in the family cemetery. But when that grave was exhumed in 1929 during the historical investigation, it was empty. Nothing but Louisiana dirt. Some historians believed Amélie had died in the room, and Charles had secretly removed her body, burying it elsewhere to avoid questions. Others thought she'd faked her death, that the stopped eating, the silence, the lack of response had all been performance, and that she'd somehow slipped out of the room and disappeared. A few noted that the sealed room's window, though covered with curtains, wasn't nailed shut. A determined Pers, on working carefully and quietly, could have opened it, climbed down using the gallery columns, and disappeared into the night. The room was high up, but not impossibly so for someone motivated and careful. Moses's letter offered no clarity. He'd written only, "Miss Amelie made her choice." Whether she stayed or left, the room remained sealed. That was the promise, and I kept it. The ambiguity seemed intentional, as if Moses wanted the mystery to remain. Tommy Reeves, the salvage worker who'd first broken through to the room, was interviewed many times over the years about what he'd found. He always described the same scene: papers everywhere, everything organized, the room frozen in time. But he added one detail that never made it into the official reports. When I first stepped in there, he told a reporter in 1952, before we started moving things around, I noticed the desk. It was covered with papers, all organized, but right in the center, like it had been placed there specifically for whoever opened the door, there was a single rose, dried, brown, crumbled at the edges. It must have been 60 years old, and next to it a note that just said, "Thank you." "Who do you think she was thanking?" the reporter asked. Tommy had shrugged. "Maybe whoever finally opened the door. Maybe Moses Durant for keeping his promise. Maybe all of us for caring enough about the past to preserve it. I don't know. But I kept that rose. Still have it." He'd pulled out a small wooden box from his desk and opened it carefully. Inside, preserved between sheets of wax paper, was a dried rose, brown, fragile, ancient, and a small piece of paper with 2 words written in elegant script. "Thank you." The Bumo NT Plantation House was demolished in 1928, despite efforts to preserve it. The cost was too high, the deterioration too advanced. But before it was torn down, the 30F floral room was carefully dismantled and reconstructed in the Louisiana State Museum in Baton Rouge. You can visit it there today. The room looks exactly as it did when Tommy Reeves first broke through that sealed door. The narrow bed, the dresser, the wardrobe with faded dresses. The desk is positioned exactly as Emily left it, though the original papers are now in climate-controlled archives. On the desk is a replica of that dried rose, and next to it the original note, "Thank you." The museum placard reads, "This room belonged to Amelie Lauron, who lived on the Beaumont Plantation from approximately 1858 to 1867. For reasons that remain partially mysterious, Miss Lauron spent the final years of her life gathering evidence about plantation operations, documenting not the official history, but the lived truth of those who experienced it. In 1867, this room was sealed. It remained sealed for 60 years until 1927, when it was opened during the Plantation House's demolition. Inside was found what is now known as the Émile Laurent collection, the most comprehensive primary source documentation of plantation life from the perspective of those who were enslaved. Whether Miss Lauron died in this room or escaped from it remains unknown. What is known is that she dedicated years of her life to preserving truth at great personal cost. She chose solitude, perhaps even death, over allowing the truth to be destroyed. What she protected was not her own safety, but the evidence that powerful people would have preferred to err. The archive she left behind has since become a lifeline for historians, genealogists, and descendants searching for fragments of lives nearly lost to silence. The 43 names she recorded are no longer just entries on a page. They are 43 family histories recovered, 43 lives restored to memory. That room stands as a testament to the power of bearing witness, to the necessity of telling the truth, especially when truth is dangerous, and to the rare courage required to preserve it when others would rather see it vanish. Each year, thousands step inside that space. Some arrive as scholars and students, others come as descendants, tracing their way back to the place where their ancestors' stories were quietly safeguarded, and some come simply out of curiosity, drawn by the legend of the locked room and the woman who chose isolation over erasure. No matter why they enter, all of them feel the same weight pressing in on the air, the weight of a truth that someone cared enough to protect for 60 years, the presence of a witness who refused to be silenced, The reminder that history does not disappear simply because it is uncomfortable, and that honoring the past often demands remembering it honestly, no matter how painful that honesty may be. Beyond the museum walls in the garden stands a modest memorial. 43 names are carved into stone, arranged alphabetically: Durant, Philip Durant, Marcus Hewitt, Sarah Pruitt, James Carter, Deline, and 38 others. Men, women, and children who lived, labored, suffered, and died on the Beaumont plantation. Lives that might have vanished from history if not for one woman who believed their stories matter. Enough to save. At the base of the memorial is a single line, taken from a letter written by Moses Durant. The truth always matters, even when it takes decades to surface. The Beaumont plantation itself is gone now. The land was divided and sold, the fields repurposed, the house erased. Only the bayou remains, still moving past the place where it once stood. But the truth endures, preserved in the careful handwriting of Amélie Lauron, locked away for 60 years, waiting, patient, protected until the world was finally ready to listen. And in that preservation, in the silence, the endurance, the refusal to let the past be erased, there is a form of justice. Not complete, not sufficient, but real. A door that stayed closed for decades has finally been opened, and the truth it guarded continues to speak, to matter, to remind us that some stories are worth protecting until the moment they can finally be heard.